I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Welcome to the Vietnam Veterans News Podcast. News of interest about Vietnam veterans from a Vietnam veteran. Now, here's your host, Mac Payne.
This is Mac Payne here with episode 1719 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. News about the Vietnam War and the brave veterans who served there, as told to you by yours truly, a Vietnam veteran, along with Dr. Bob Rodrigues, the notable history professor from the Duquesne University there in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. In the previous two episodes, Dr. Rodrigues has been telling us all about the year 1968 in the Vietnam War. He's taking it from start to finish and covering all points in between. In this episode, he's going to wrap up the year 1968 by covering all the momentous events that happened that year that made it a year to remember. Some people would like to say a year to forget after you listen to all the things that happened in that year. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Bob. And again, I want to encourage everyone to get rid of all the distractions. Pick up a pencil and paper so you can take notes, because this episode is going to be packed full of very, very interesting information that you will want to remember. So without any further ado, Dr. Bob, it's all yours.
On March 16th, same year, 1968, we had the event known as My Lai. My Lai was the most celebrated atrocity of the Vietnam War. Lieutenant William Calley, Charlie Company, went into a village of My Lai and killed 526 villagers. There was a lot that led up to My Lai, and I rather save that for our focus on My Lai in the next couple podcasts. I can relate some good accounts to My Lai because for 16 years I had a friend, became a friend, who was one of the soldiers there with Charlie Company at My Lai. And his name was Fred Widmer, and he did kill a 9-year-old boy. But what Fred is going to reveal, and I will do this with you on the podcast, is not so much was My Lai an atrocity, but why did it happen? Why did young American boys go into that village and wantonly kill? So we'll talk about that more closely next time, another time. As Johnson's popularity begins to plummet, Senator Robert Kennedy announces that he's going to run for the presidency. That's probably going to precipitate even more so Johnson's decision not to seek re-election. See, Johnson and Robert Kennedy were, in many ways, you can refer to them as enemies. They did not like each other. Johnson considered Robert Kennedy an upstart. Kennedy considered Johnson a bigoted person who inherited the White House by an accident. So there was no love lost there. And surely Johnson would not want to lose the nomination for the party to Robert Kennedy. And by now the protests were getting noisier. There were people surrounding the White House almost 24 hours a day, just walking around and shouting different slogans like, hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? And this began to affect Johnson in a lot of ways. We'll talk about that again. In Memphis, Tennessee, on April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King is assassinated by James Earl Ray. And this is going to he was the embodiment of the Civil Rights Movement. He was a leader among the African Americans, and this is going to just ignite riots, destruction all over the country. Detroit was probably the worst hit. Blocks of Detroit were burned down. But these protests occurred everywhere, and they were just a gut reaction from the African American community to protest the loss of their leader. A few weeks later, actually a couple months later, Robert Kennedy is assassinated in Los Angeles, California, after he delivered a speech and he had won the primary in California. He was in the Ambassador Hotel. Shots rang out, and he too was assassinated. His assassin was Sirhan Sirhan, who was still in jail. In June 1968, General William Westmoreland departs as the commander of American forces in Vietnam. Remember now, he had really undergone two blows in the past year. One was the rejection of a troop increase of over 200,000 that he had asked for. And then second, the Tet Offensive. Everything had been focused on Quezon On, and because of that, there was a surprise element in the South. Vo Nguyen Giap, the celebrated general of the North Vietnam, clearly had set up Quezon On as a ruse, as just a, we're going to make it look like, and then they'll ignore what was going on in the South. And we did. Westmoreland was replaced by General Creighton Abrams. He's going to take over in June. So 1968 resulted in the highest number of casualties in any single year, with more than 16,000 Americans and approximately 100,000 Vietnamese killed. All the while, the North Vietnamese and the National Liberation Front began to fight on. No changes. And what you're going to see now is a clear-cut change on the part of American temperament. There's now more and more thinking of how can we honorably get out of this war? How can we transfer all of the fighting to the ARVN and be able to just exit gracefully? And this was the difficulty that back in 1964 and 65 when the decision was made to put boots on the ground. This is why you had a lot of naysayers at that particular point saying, once you're in there, it's hard to get out once you put the boots down. So 1968 was a pivotal year in so many ways. It changed the landscape of American politics with the deaths of two leaders in King and Robert Kennedy, and almost the declawing of President Lyndon Johnson, that he no longer had the clout. He had not delivered on so many things. Westmoreland had exited, and the country was very much in disarray. That's why it is such a significant year, 1968. It'll take us in to the rest of the Vietnam. But this is when there is clearly a change in the thinking back in America. The protests become more intense. They become more frequent. And you're almost approaching a civil war in America. In our next podcast, we'll talk about the counterculture that began to develop very strongly at home in regard to the Vietnam War. Okay, Mac, thank you very much, and we'll talk next time.
Thank you, Dr. Bob, for that excellent wrap-up of the year 1968 during the Vietnam War. It turned out to be a very momentous year. With that done, in the next episode, we're going to move on to the counterculture that was going on here in the States during the Vietnam War. We can hardly wait. This is Mac Payne closing out episode 1719. Thank you so much for coming to listen to these stories. You are cordially invited to return again soon and often to listen to more stories coming your way on this podcast, the Vietnam Veteran News.
How about that? Ain't that a mess?